So I was afraid to bring it all the way down.
Is that a comfortable level for you?
This is, I think, I'll find out.
Okay, I'm gonna have to crouch.
Oh,
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. Welcome to the Brown Bag Speakers Forum. I'm Paul with the library, and this program is a co-presentation with the Albany Y, the library, and KALB. KALB is filming today, and today's program, along with some others that are already up there, will be on their YouTube channel and also rebroadcast on KLB. So before we get started, I want to tell you about a few upcoming programs here. So on October 19th, we have George Lakoff doing a post-debate discussion. And we'll be opening the doors at 5:30, letting people in. And at 6 o'clock, we'll watch the debate together, and then a discussion will follow with George Lakoff offering his insights. Next month for the Brown Bags, we'll have Lynn Henderson. She'll be here to talk about her work with shyness. And in December, we'll have storyteller and author Joel Ben-Izzy. His latest book he'll be talking about is Dreidels on the Brain. And here's the blurb for that. At last, a great American Hanukkah story. This very funny, very touching novel of growing up Jewish has the makings of a holiday classic. So that's in December. But today, we're pleased to welcome Charna Shakow from the Commission for the Preservation of Pioneer Jewish Cemeteries and Landmarks. She's here to tell you about their work to preserve and maintain these cemeteries and their efforts to educate the public about them. Please join me in welcoming Charna.
all righty. And I put together a presentation, so, and afterwards I'll give plenty of time for questions, so hopefully you'll bear with us because we're coordinating. My husband Peter's in the back, who's my technology expert. I bring him everywhere with me. So, thank you, Paul, for your invitation for today. The Commission is an organization which Peter and I have been involved actively in for the past 6.5 years, and which I've been involved personally as a docent and a teacher for over 3 decades. But before I even begin sharing the history and objectives of the Commission itself, let me step back about 165 years to be exact for just a few minutes so that I can share with you the history and experiences of those European Jews who helped to establish the foundation of today's Bay Area Jewish community, as well as many of San Francisco's cultural institutions. They came for the most part from Germany, France, and Poland, leaving behind their homes and families. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was a necessary one. At first, it was mostly young single Jewish men and a few single Jewish women who came to Northern California. They were escaping from harsh conditions in their European hometowns. Tailors and shoemakers were hardest hit when the Industrial Revolution reached Germany and France in the early 1820s, and factories refused to allow Jews to work in them. Many of the Jewish states or German states established harsh quotas on how many Jewish homes could be set up each year, forcing many young men and women to leave their hometowns so they could marry and have families of their own. Polish Prussia and Bavarian German states also began to conscript young Jewish boys, sometimes as young as 11 or 12 years old, forcing them to serve for a minimum of 25 years and not allowing them any contact with their families. In many instances, they were forced to convert to Christianity and to marry Christian women when they reached marrying age. At the same time that Jews in Europe were experiencing these difficult situations, a young United States was trying to attract new immigrants to its shores, promising them free land if they could farm it, and most importantly, freedom to practice their own religions. And then in 1848, gold was discovered by James Marshall in the American River at Sutter's Mill. It took a full year for news to travel across the United States and across the world. But once it spread, there was no stopping these young pioneers who risked life and limb to travel to California to seek their fortunes. Zellerbach, Steinhardt, Strauss, DeYoung, Goldwater, Fleischhacker, Sutro. Sound familiar? All are names of Jewish pioneers who participated in the California Gold Rush. Most Jewish participants brought their old world skills with them, merchandising and tailoring for the most part. A few participated in different areas of the mining industry as miners themselves, or surveyors, assayers, or as mine superintendents. Most Jews never earned much money during the gold rush. In fact, many went bankrupt and moved on to new opportunities in San Francisco and Portland, Los Angeles, Alaska, and the small towns of the Oregon and Washington territories. But a few did manage to hit the mother lode, as the saying went. Those names you just heard me list are examples of the few Jews who earned millions and then, thankful for having been fully accepted into their newly adopted land, left large parts of their fortunes to the city of San Francisco and the state of California to be used to create new social institutions such as museums, free parks and concerts, libraries, zoos, and foundations dedicated to helping the needy. I'd like to show you a brief video clip from the Heritage, Civilization, and the Jews program developed and funded by the Charles H. Revson Foundation and narrated by the former Israeli ambassador to the United States, Abba Eban. This clip will share the life that awaited many of these young single Jewish men when they arrived in the American West.
In 1807, a man named Fulton harnessed steam to propel riverboats along the great waterways that led to the interior of the continent. Within 5 years, the adventurous were being advised of regular service from the eastern seaboard into the wilderness of Ohio and Kentucky. The news of opportunities on the American frontier reached as far as Europe. Before long, settlers were arriving by the thousands. In the 1850s, spurred by political turmoil in Europe, 1 million came from the German lands alone, and among them more than 100,000 German-speaking Jews. It was the beginning of a substantial Jewish presence in America. Leaving behind the close-knit Jewish communities of Europe, these Jews discovered in the backwoods of this continent a solitary way of life unlike any they had ever known. Throughout this frontier region were thousands of remote farmsteads, hundreds of isolated settlements that had only one tie to the outside world, the itinerant peddler. For many of the young Jewish men who came to America, a horse and a cart full of goods were an early step on the road toward fortune. The peddler was a welcome guest on the frontier. He brought news. He brought goods. He brought the necessities the pioneer family could not make for itself. But frontier life was often perplexing for the Jewish immigrant. From the diary of a peddler in the 1840s.
We have left our friends and acquaintances, our relatives and our parents, our language and our customs, only to sell our wares in the wild places of America, in isolated farmhouses and tiny hamlets. Leading such a life, none of us is able to observe the smallest commandment. On Sunday, every farmer urges me to attend church.
A Jewish peddler striving to survive found it difficult to avoid working on Saturday, the Jewish Sabbath, difficult to observe the dietary laws of his people. On the American continent, with its frontier ways and scattered settlements, the immigrant had to take life as he found it. He had to leave behind his old language, his old customs and experiences. He had to become a pioneer among other pioneers. It started with a 100-pound pack, with peddlers who trudged mile after weary mile. In time, the pack gave way to the one-horse wagon. If he was fortunate, the Jewish peddler saved and eventually opened a general store. The general store frequently became the focus of a permanent settlement. Because he was an early settler, the storekeeper frequently became the sheriff or mayor or leading citizen of the town. Other Jews might join him there and form a small Jewish congregation. The German Jews became part and parcel of the epic opening of the American West. Jewish merchants were among many immigrants who contributed in these years to the development of a new America.
According to rabbinic law, the first property a Jewish community must purchase is a plot of land on which to establish a Jewish cemetery. This goes back to the book of Genesis, where God commands Abraham to purchase the cave of the Machpelah in Hebron, in which to bury his wife Sarah and eventually other members of his family. In the Wild West conditions existing in the early years of the California gold rush, where violence, disease, and frequent fires took many lives, this was an especially important purchase for the new Jewish immigrants. The first known Jewish burial in the Mother Lode area was in a cemetery established by the Hebrew congregation of Sonora in 1851. The young man buried first was Hartwig Caro, a native of Posen, Prussia. He was only 17 years old. The Hebrew inscription on the gravestone reads, "To our beloved son and brother." Also inscribed on the stone are the dates of his birth and death, 1836 to 1853. Sadly, the letters which tell us the names of the family he left behind are too faded to read. It's at this point that I'd like to share with you the history of the commission. In April 2010, the Commission for the Preservation of Pioneer Jewish Cemeteries and Landmarks in the West became an independent 501c3 organization. For almost half a century since its founding in 1962, the Commission had operated as a trust of the Judah L. Magnus Memorial Museum in Berkeley, having been established for the purpose of identifying, acquiring, restoring, and preserving the pioneer Jewish cemeteries in the American West. Here we have the late Seymour Fromer, co-founder of the Magnus Museum and one of the founders of the Commission. And this is Stephen Zellerbach, another co-founder of the Commission and its chairman for over 40 years. You may recognize his family name thanks to his great-grandfather, Anthony Zellerbach, who was a successful paper merchant in San Francisco during the latter days of the gold rush. His Zellerbach Paper Company eventually merged with the Crown Paper Company to form the Crown Zellerbach Corporation. Anthony donated money to many institutions, including UC Berkeley, which named an auditorium for him. Why was it necessary to form the commission? It owes its existence really to this man, Dr. Robert Levinson. He was teaching history at San Jose State back in the 1960s while working on his doctorate. The focus of his doctoral research was on the history of the Jews of the Gold Rush era. Amazingly, no one had ever formally studied this era in Jewish history before. He spent several years traveling through the Sierras, gathering information from local historians, searching out sites mentioned in newspaper clippings, journals, and other documents that he found. What he discovered shocked him. He discovered Jewish cemeteries scattered throughout the Mother Lode region in terrible condition. In the case of a few cemeteries like Sonora and Placerville, local residents had tried to maintain the grounds as best they could, weeding and pruning limbs off overhanging trees. But in most of the cemeteries, you could barely see some of the graves because of all the overgrowth. In many cases, stones had toppled and broken. and in all the cemeteries the weather took its toll on the stones, leaving some in such terrible condition that you couldn't make out what had been carved on them anymore. Some years before beginning his research, Bob Levinson had met Seymour Fromer and knew of his reputation for fundraising. He approached Seymour at the start of 1961 and took him on a tour of the pioneer cemeteries which he had identified as being most in need of restoration. By 1962, they had established the commission, discovered the original deeds to the cemetery properties, and convinced the communities to deed the cemeteries to the commission for nominal fees. The cemeteries are in Sonora, Placerville, Jackson, McCulloughney Hill, Grass Valley, and Nevada City. Later, in 1995, a seventh cemetery in Marysville was also deeded to the commission. They raised enough money to begin the restoration process, which eventually took almost a decade for the first phase to be completed, restoring the most badly damaged gravestones. Tragically, in June 1980, Dr. Levinson was killed in an auto accident at the age of 41, leaving behind his wife, Faye, and their 3 young children. With the help of Seymour and the commission trustees, Faye continued to carry on his legacy by ensuring that the work of the commission continues. She herself is currently serving as the secretary of the commission. And just last year, the commission set up the Robert E. Levinson Annual Fellowship, which is awarded through UC's Bancroft Library, providing grants for the study of the Jewish experience in the American West. Other cemetery restoration work followed over the next 2 decades into the 1990s, including more gravestone restorations, ground landscaping, setting up walls or fences around the cemeteries where none existed, or repairing existing dividers. Signs and plaques were set up to mark the sites as historical landmarks. Much of this work was accomplished by volunteers living close to the cemeteries, as well as by members of synagogue and fraternal groups from the Greater Bay Area who volunteered their time to help restore the cemeteries. The Commission today welcomes community projects that support its mission. Past projects have included Eagle Scout, Bar Bat Mitzvah, and Fraternal Order service projects. The restoration work is far from complete. A lot of the work is so specialized that we have to hire materials experts to be sure we don't do anything to the stones that may damage them now or in the future. We also have to work with archaeologists from local universities, since there are so many pieces of the original gravestones lying on the ground, broken into very small pieces which have been scattered by foot traffic over time and which need to be identified. For a while, all of this restoration work was put on hold when the Magnus Museum merged with the Contemporary Jewish Museum in San Francisco back in 2002. When it became apparent that the merger would not work out, the Magnus reopened in 2003. But with new leadership at the museum, Seymour Fromer had retired in 1997, and with a slowing down of contributions during the difficult dot-com crash era, all restoration work was put on hold again, and the commission was barely able to raise enough money for cemetery maintenance requirements. The museum struggled for the next few years, but was ultimately unsuccessful in its attempts to raise money for its own needs, let alone for those of the commission. Then, in 2010, with the Magnus Museum about to close because of lack of funds, an agreement was reached with UC Berkeley for the university's Jewish Studies Department to take over the Magnus's extensive collection of Judaica, the 3rd largest collection in the United States. The museum's Western Jewish History Center, an archival library documenting the Jewish experience in the American West, was taken over by UC's Bancroft Library. The commission was technically a part of the Western Jewish History Center, but unfortunately the Bancroft could not take over the commission because of liability insurance issues. It was at this point that the commission trustees voted to become an independent nonprofit 501c3 entity. Since April of 2010, Stephen Kinsey, pictured here, a student of Dr. Levinson's and a member of the commission since its founding, has been its chairman. Because a community cannot truly appreciate itself or carry a sense of pride to its succeeding generations without understanding its origins, the Reformed Commission's Board of Directors decided to establish an education committee, the goal of which would be to design educational curricula and materials that would share the history of the Jewish communities of the Gold Rush with a new generation through the focal lens of the cemeteries. And this is where I entered the picture. I had been a docent and a docent outreach presenter for the Magnus Museum since 1984, and since 1989 I'd been teaching religious school, first at Congregation Bethel in Berkeley, and beginning in 2000 at Temple Isaiah in Lafayette, where I still teach today. I was already familiar with the commission and had also been involved in developing a slideshow presentation about the Jews of the California Gold Rush for our docent outreach program. In 1995, I began to take my students and their families on field trips to the cemeteries to share the stories of these early pioneers. I had already begun to develop my own materials for teaching the subject in preparation for the field trips, so it was no surprise that I was asked to become the chairperson of the newly formed Education Committee in 2010. Since then, we've been working with local historians and educators to develop field trips and classroom activities which bring this little-known era of Jewish history to life. We've recently also begun to expand our horizons and are developing adult learning opportunities about the Jews of the Gold Rush era. We're in the early stages of developing a speakers bureau, and we're working with docent organizations in state parks and museums in the Mother Lode region to develop curricula and materials to teach visitors about the Jewish pioneers in their communities. We've also recently begun to establish relationships with other Jewish and non-Jewish organizations, such as the Sinai Memorial Chapel and several genealogical and historical societies, to work together on projects. We have so much more work that still needs to be done. There are other Jewish pioneer cemeteries outside of the Mother Lode region which have been identified and which we are researching both in California and in Oregon, which we'd like to be sure are being well taken care of. And there is so much more restoration and maintenance work we have to do in our own cemeteries. In the end, we'll conserve only what we love, we'll love only what we understand, and we'll understand only what we have been taught. I'd like to end my presentation today with a trailer we put together a few years ago for fundraising purposes. I share it with you today to give you a peek into how we're trying to bring the history to life for our younger generation.
In the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains, about a 2.5-hour drive north from San Francisco, are 7 pioneer Jewish cemeteries dating back to the legendary California Gold Rush of 1849. For decades, these cemeteries were forgotten and untended. In 1962, the Commission for the Preservation of Pioneer Jewish Cemeteries and Landmarks in the West was established as a trust of the Judah L. Magnus Memorial Museum in Berkeley, California. The Commission, now an independent nonprofit organization, maintains and restores these important historical sites and ensures that the individual and community stories of the pioneer Jews buried here are shared with the public. Students and their families now have the opportunity to connect with their past in this way, helping them to feel proud of their Jewish heritage and understand and appreciate the legacy these pioneers left for us. Every year, a group of 5th graders and their families from Temple Isaiah's religious school in Lafayette, California, visit the Pioneer Jewish Cemetery in Sonora, rain or shine. They spend a month preparing for the trip.
Commandments? 13. Remember, as
After
many
being introduced to the early
commandments as
history of
possible.
Jews in America, the students work through a series of activities designed by the Commission to help them identify with the Jews who came to California as part of the first wave of non-native peoples to settle there. They work together to think of solutions to real problems these people face to maintain their Jewish identity and create a Jewish community.
Why I became a historian. I became a historian because
A local historian, Dr. Eva Kahn, one of the leading historians of Western Jewish history, spoke to this class about the research techniques of historians and about the history of the Jews of the Gold Rush, focusing on the story of Mary Goldsmith Prague, a pioneer Jewish woman.
Now, Mary Goldsmith Prague came to California in 1852. This is what she looked like when she was older.
Students were asked to read excerpts from diaries and newspaper articles written by California's pioneer Jews in the 1850s and 1860s, and to answer questions related to the readings. Through this process, they learned about the Jewish life these people left behind in Europe, about the roots and the difficulties of the journeys to California, what they had to do to maintain their Jewish identity and rituals in the Gold Rush communities, and finally about what local non-Jews thought about their Jewish neighbors.
What you're going to get is you're going to get the questions.
For the final pre-trip activity, each was given an archive of a Jewish pioneer man or woman buried in one of the 7 pioneer cemeteries. The archive contained specific biographical data, along with general information they had learned from the previous group activities. When photographs or other documents were available, they were included as well. Each student was then asked to assume the identity of a pioneer and write a letter home or a diary entry, in this way sharing what they had learned over the previous few weeks about the life of Jews in pioneer Gold Rush communities. During the trip to the Sonora Cemetery, students and their parents watched a documentary called Birth of a Community, Jews in the Gold Rush, providing the parents with some of the information the students had already learned in class. Each family was given a packet of information filled with more readings relating to Sonora and its Jewish community, as well as Gold Rush era songs and activity worksheets.
In the first story, you don't hear much about people dying.
No.
The second story,
It's all about people
it sounds like
getting
half
sick
the
and
people
dying.
died.
Yeah.
Is to have a gold on hand in case the charity is.
Following a tour of pioneer Jewish homes and businesses in Columbia State Historic Park, at the Sonora Cemetery, students stood by the gravesite of their assigned pioneer and read the letters they had written in class.
1865.
Dear Mom, it's been 39 long years since I had to escape from Germany so that I wouldn't get drafted.
I wish I could tell you that we are following our Jewish laws completely, but it is hard to learn a living here from our small store.
My hopes and dreams for the future are to help build a synagogue and a Hebrew school for our community. December 26, 1852. Dear Uncle Samuel, it has been 2 years since I boarded that ship in Bremen, Germany, with my father, mother, and brother, and sailed to America.
In years past, a popular activity during school field trips to historical cemeteries was to do gravestone rubbings. It became apparent a few years ago that the stones were too fragile to have rubbings made of them. Instead, a treasure hunt for gravestone symbols was given to each family. Students worked together with their parents to find symbols such as lambs and doves representing children's graves, broken tree limbs or wilted flowers representing someone who died in their prime, and fraternal organization symbols showing who was a Mason or a member of the Odd Fellows, fraternal organizations to which many pioneer Jewish men belonged.
Many Jewish gravestones have 5 Hebrew letters at the top or bottom of the stone. What are these 5 Hebrew letters? Tav, Nun, Sadi, Vet,
Students learned about Jewish rituals relating to visiting cemeteries, such as reciting the Kaddish, the mourner's prayer, and placing pebbles on the gravestones. Educational materials and activities provided by the Cemetery Commission help to ensure that the students and their families will remember the Jewish pioneers buried here and share their stories with others.
Oh, it's okay. It just pretty much finishes as we go out the fence there. And it was raining all day that day. So I brought along some commission brochures, and they're on the small table up here. And please feel free to take one for yourself and maybe one or two to share with friends. We're always looking for new members. I also brought some copies of A Traveler's Guide to Pioneer Jewish Cemeteries of the California Gold Rush, written by a member of the commission, Susan Morris. Susan was the chief archivist of the Western Jewish History Center in the early 1990s and later became the executive director of the Magnus Museum. If you're interested in driving to Gold Rush country, this guide will lead you to each of the 7 cemeteries and will share what Susan learned from her extensive research about the pioneers buried in each cemetery. So thank you again for sharing your time with me this afternoon, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have. Yes.
This video that we just watched, while the students and families were on the bus, it mentioned they were watching a video. Is that available?
It is available. It's Bill Shays is a local videographer, filmmaker. He lives in Petaluma and has his own company, and he was the curator of the photography and film section of the Magnus Museum for many years. He was a professor of film studies at San Francisco State, I believe. And now he is an independent filmmaker, and he created a 45-minute or so film, but it was geared toward adults, and that's why I don't show it until we're on the bus, because it's really more for the parents who did not have the benefit of being in the classroom and learning all the history, so it kind of brings everyone up to par. But it is available. I think if you look up, I'm trying to think, Bill Shays Productions. And in fact, the brochure we have has it in our publications. So the brochure will mention it on one of the parts, what the publications are, and his video is part of it. In fact, I think there's a little typo in the brochure, unfortunately, that we missed, and it says that his video, the Birth of a Community, Jews in the Gold Rush, was published together with a teacher's guide for how to teach using that. But what we're also working on and trying desperately to raise money to fund, and this trailer was a part of the filming, is making a film where, from the child's point of view, to create, because all the films about the Jews of the Gold Rush that have been made, and there's a more recent one, I think, Jerusalem, Paris, or what was it called? I've forgotten the name of it, but it's a 2.5-hour film. They're all geared toward adults, which is fine. But what our focus is, and of course mine as a teacher, is in sharing that with the next generation. And it mentions, talking about teaching it in Jewish schools, but now we're also beginning to write curricula since 4th grade. Part of the California state curriculum is to teach about the Gold Rush. California history and the Gold Rush, of course, is part of it. In 4th grade, we're creating curricula for 4th and actually all the way up through 12th grade. Classes for teachers so that they can bring, again, using the cemeteries as the focus of the curricula. And we have the books on sale for $18. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the symbolic number 18, which in Hebrew letters, just like Roman numerals, the ancient used the Hebrew letters for numbers. And 18 is Yud, which is 10, and Chet, which is 8. And if you just, when you read Hebrew from right to left, Chai is life in Hebrew. And so it's traditional to give charity in multiples of 18, so 1836, etc. So the books are on sale for $18 to help us. And there is, Sue is working now on updating the books, at which the update will be available online for free. If you have the book, the update will make sense. So, but again, if you have a chance to go up to Gold Rush Country, she gives you the routes to take, if you want to do 1 day, 2 day, 3 days. And she also gives a history of each of the communities, Columbia and Marysville. So not just the specific cemetery and the people buried there, but the communities themselves and the Jewish experience in those communities. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your time. Enjoy the day.